Hi, I'm Natalie. 8 months ago, my parents signed a DNR order while I was fighting for my life in a coma. They told the hospital I wouldn't want to live like that. What they didn't know was that I heard everything. Every word. Every lie. When I woke up, they'd already split my inheritance and erased me from the family trust. But the moment I walked into that courtroom and they saw me standing there, alive, my father collapsed against the bench and my mother's face went white as death itself. What happened next wasn't just about money or betrayal. It was about proving I was worth fighting for when no one else would. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Have you ever been written off by the people who were supposed to protect you? Keep watching, because what I discovered while they thought I was dying changed everything. The rain came down in sheets that March afternoon in Portland, the kind that turns the streets into mirrors and makes the whole city smell like wet concrete and pine. I remember the sound of it against the windshield, rhythmic and almost hypnotic, before everything went dark. They told me later that a delivery truck ran the red light at the intersection of Burnside and 23rd. My sedan crumpled like paper. The EMTs said I was lucky to be alive, but luck is a strange word for what came next. I woke up 8 months later. Not all at once, not like in the movies where someone's eyes flutter open and they smile at their loved ones gathered around the bed. It was gradual, like surfacing from deep water, sounds filtering in before sight, then the weight of my own body, then pain sharp and insistent in places I couldn't yet name. The first thing I truly registered was a voice. Not my mother's, not my father's. It was Dr. Keisha Reynolds, the ICU attending who I'd later learn had fought to keep me on life support when my family wanted to let me go. Her voice was warm, steady, the kind that doesn't lie to you but doesn't give up on you either. She was talking to a nurse about my vitals, something about pupil response improving, and I wanted to tell her I could hear her, but my mouth wouldn't move. Nothing would move. Panic rose in my chest like water filling a locked room. I tried to scream and nothing came out. That's when I heard the second voice, softer, closer. It's okay, sweetheart. We've got you. You're safe now. That was Grace Okonkwo, the night nurse who'd been monitoring me for weeks. Later, she'd tell me she used to read to me during her shifts, poetry mostly, Langston Hughes and Maya Angelou, because she believed coma patients could hear. She was right. I'd heard more than poetry. 3 weeks before I woke up, I'd heard my parents in the room. I couldn't open my eyes, couldn't move a finger, but I could hear every syllable. My mother's voice came first, clipped and efficient, the way she spoke when she was handling unpleasant business. The doctors say there's no improvement, Caroline said. It's been over 7 months. We need to be realistic. My father's voice followed, deeper, resigned. She wouldn't want this. You know Natalie. She was always so independent. She'd hate being kept alive like this. I screamed inside my paralyzed body. I'm here. I'm still here. But nothing moved. Not a twitch, not a flutter. I was a prisoner in my own flesh. Derek's voice joined them then, my older brother, the golden child who'd always known how to say the right thing to get what he wanted. Mom, Dad, I know this is hard, but we have to think about what's best for everyone. The medical bills are piling up. Natalie's insurance is almost maxed out. And you two aren't getting any younger. The stress of this is killing you both. There was a pause, the kind that fills with unspoken decisions. Then my mother again, quieter now, almost tender. She was always such a free spirit. Maybe this is her way of telling us to let her go. I would have vomited if I could. A free spirit. She'd never called me that when I was conscious. Reckless, maybe. Impractical, definitely. But never free. My father cleared his throat. I'll talk to the estate attorney tomorrow. If we're going to do this, we need to make sure everything's in order. The house, the trust, all of it. That's when I understood. They weren't here to say goodbye. They were here to divide what was left of me before I was even gone. The DNR order was signed 2 days later. Dr. Reynolds told me about it months afterward, her jaw tight with anger she'd kept professional at the time. Your family requested we remove life support and sign a do not resuscitate order. They said you'd expressed wishes not to be kept alive artificially. I pushed back. I told them your scans were showing subtle improvements, that there was still neurological activity. But they had the legal right. So why didn't you pull the plug? I asked her, my voice still raspy from months of disuse. She looked at me for a long moment, her dark eyes serious. Because I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've learned to trust my gut. Your brain activity wasn't consistent with someone in a vegetative state. You were in there. I knew it. She'd kept me on the ventilator, kept the feeding tube in place, kept me alive against my family's wishes by citing medical protocols and ordering tests that bought time. Every week, she'd document small changes, micro improvements in brain activity that gave her justification to delay. She became my advocate when I had no voice, my fighter when I couldn't raise a fist. But she couldn't stop them from doing everything else. I learned about it piece by piece during my first weeks of consciousness. My Aunt Helen was the one who told me the full story. She showed up at the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon, her arms full of flowers and her eyes full of fury. She was my father's younger sister, the one the family had quietly shunned years ago for marrying outside their social circle and refusing to play by their rules. Natalie, she said, pulling a chair close to my bed, there's something you need to know. Your parents didn't just sign a DNR. They've been busy. She laid it out like evidence in a trial. While I was unresponsive, my parents had petitioned the court for financial guardianship, claiming I was incapacitated and unable to manage my affairs. It was granted within 6 weeks. With that authority, they transferred the deed to my grandmother's house, the one she'd left specifically to me in her will, into a family trust controlled by my father. They'd liquidated my small investment account, the one I'd been building since my first job at 16. They'd even closed my business, a small graphic design consultancy I'd been running for 3 years, claiming it was no longer viable. The kicker? My grandmother's life insurance policy, $250,000 that was supposed to come to me when she passed 2 years ago, had been redirected into an estate account my mother managed. Managed and apparently spent, because according to Aunt Helen's digging, there was almost nothing left. They thought you were never waking up, Helen said, her voice shaking. So they took everything. And Derek helped them do it. He told them it was the practical thing, that they were protecting family assets. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them because if I didn't focus on something mundane I was going to fall apart. 48 tiles. 12 rows of 4. One had a water stain shaped like a bird. Why are you telling me this? I finally asked. Because you're my niece and I love you. And because your grandmother made me promise that if anything ever happened to you, I'd make sure you knew the truth about this family. She saw through them long before you did. My grandmother had been the only one who understood me. While my parents pushed me toward law school or medicine, something respectable, she'd encouraged my art. She'd paid for my first real camera, set me up with contacts in the design world, told me that creating beauty was just as important as creating wealth. When she died, she'd left me her house in the West Hills, a modest craftsman with a view of the city and a studio space in the converted attic. That house was supposed to be my foundation, my safety net, my proof that at least one person believed I could build something meaningful. Now it was gone. I need to see the paperwork, I told Helen. All of it. She nodded. I thought you might. I've already made copies. But Natalie, you need to be prepared. Fighting this is going to be ugly. Your parents have money, lawyers, and they'll paint you as unstable, emotional, vindictive. They'll say you're not thinking clearly after the trauma. Let them say whatever they want, I said. My voice was still weak, but something in my chest had gone hard and cold. I died in that car. I died again when they signed that DNR. I've got nothing left to lose. That wasn't entirely true. I had something they didn't know about yet. While my parents had been busy dismantling my life, Dr. Reynolds had been documenting everything. Every visit they made, every conversation she overheard, every decision they pushed for against medical advice. She'd kept meticulous records, not because she knew I'd wake up, but because something about their behavior had troubled her from the start. Families grieve in different ways, she told me later, but your parents never grieved. They planned. 2 weeks after I regained consciousness, I was moved to a rehabilitation facility in the Pearl District. Insurance covered most of it, barely, and Aunt Helen covered the rest. My parents didn't visit. They called once, a stilted conversation where my mother asked how I was feeling and my father mentioned something about needing time to process the miracle of my recovery. They didn't mention the house. They didn't mention the money. They acted like everything was normal, like I was supposed to be grateful they were speaking to me at all. I played along. I told them I was tired, that I needed to focus on physical therapy, that we'd talk more when I was stronger. They seemed relieved. Meanwhile, I was meeting with Marcus Chin. Marcus had been my friend since middle school, back when we were both awkward kids who ate lunch in the library and argued about whether Batman or Spider-Man had the better rogues gallery. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd gone to law school at Lewis and Clark, passed the bar on his first try, and built a practice focused on medical malpractice and elder abuse. When Aunt Helen told him what happened, he showed up at my rehab facility within 24 hours. He sat across from me in the common room, his laptop open, his expression grim. Natalie, what they did is legally complex but morally straightforward. They exploited your incapacity for financial gain. The question is whether we can prove it crossed the line into fraud. Can we? I asked. He tapped his pen against his notepad, thinking. The guardianship was legal. The transfers were technically authorized under that guardianship. But there are a few angles. First, the speed at which they moved suggests premeditation. Second, your grandmother's will was explicit about the house going to you, not the family trust. They may have violated the terms of her estate. Third, Dr. Reynolds's documentation could establish a pattern of behavior inconsistent with acting in your best interest. What do you need from me? Everything you remember. Every conversation, every document, every bank statement. And I need you to be ready for them to fight dirty. I smiled, and it felt strange on my face, like I'd forgotten how. I've been dead for 8 months, Marcus. Dirty doesn't scare me anymore. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked with Marcus to build the case. We requested financial records, pulled court documents from the guardianship proceedings, interviewed hospital staff who'd interacted with my family. Dr. Reynolds provided a sworn affidavit detailing my parents' repeated requests to discontinue care despite medical evidence of improvement. Grace gave a statement about the time she'd overheard them discussing my assets in the ICU waiting room, casual conversations about selling the house or accessing the insurance money while I was 20 feet away, unresponsive. The picture that emerged was damning. My parents hadn't just made difficult decisions during a tragedy. They'd seen an opportunity and taken it. But the smoking gun came from an unexpected source. Derek's wife, Vanessa. She showed up at my rehab facility on a rainy Tuesday evening, her designer coat soaked, mascara smudged. She looked like she'd been crying for hours. When the receptionist called my room, I almost told them to send her away. But something stopped me. Curiosity, maybe. Or the sense that people don't fall apart like that unless they're carrying something too heavy to hold alone. She sat in the chair by the window, hands twisted in her lap. I'm sorry, she said. I'm so sorry, Natalie. I waited. I'd learned that silence makes people talk. Derek's been lying to me, she continued. About a lot of things. But mostly about you. He told me you'd want this, that you'd be grateful we were taking care of things while you recovered. He made it sound like we were helping. Were you? I asked flatly. She flinched. No. God, no. We took everything. And I didn't realize how much until I saw the documents. Your grandmother's house, the insurance money, your business. Derek has the house listed with a realtor. They're planning to sell it next month. My hands gripped the armrests of my wheelchair. They're selling it. She nodded, tears streaming now. I didn't know what to do. I thought about staying quiet, but then I thought about if it was me in that bed, and someone did this to me, and I just couldn't. So I made copies. Of everything. She pulled a USB drive from her purse and set it on the table between us. Bank transfers, emails between Derek and your parents, messages with the realtor. It's all there. I don't know if it's enough, but it's the truth. I stared at the small black drive like it was a grenade. Why are you doing this? Because it's wrong. And because I have a daughter now. If something happened to me, I'd want someone to fight for her. Your family should have fought for you. Instead, they buried you alive. She left before I could say anything else, and I sat alone in the fading light, holding the USB drive in my palm. It was so small, so ordinary. But it held the proof that would change everything. That night, I called Marcus. We need to move faster, I told him. They're selling the house. Then we file tomorrow, he said. And Natalie? Get ready. Once we do this, there's no going back. I looked out the window at the city lights blurred by rain, at the life I was supposed to be living somewhere out there beyond the glass. I've already come back from the dead once, I said. I'm not afraid of forward. The petition was filed at 9 a.m. the following morning. A civil suit alleging financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraudulent transfer of assets. We requested immediate injunction to halt the sale of the house and freeze the estate accounts pending investigation. We also filed a separate motion to nullify the guardianship retroactively based on evidence of self-dealing. By noon, my parents' attorney had called Marcus, threatening sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit. By 3 p.m., the judge had granted a temporary restraining order freezing all assets connected to my grandmother's estate. By 5, my father had left 3 voicemails, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Natalie, this is your father. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to call me immediately. This is family business, and you're making a terrible mistake. I deleted it without listening to the rest. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, Marcus deposed Dr. Reynolds, pulled medical records, and built a timeline that showed my parents had started contacting estate attorneys within days of my admission to the ICU. We had emails where my mother discussed liquidating my investment account to cover their property taxes. We had text messages between Derek and my father about getting the house appraised while I was still unresponsive. And we had Vanessa's files. Transaction records showing money transferred from my accounts into theirs. Real estate documents signed with my father's power of attorney. An email chain where my mother casually mentioned that once I was gone, they could finally renovate their kitchen. Once I was gone. Not if. Once. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the common room of the rehab facility, watching headlights streak past on the wet street below, and I thought about all the ways I'd tried to earn their approval over the years. The college I'd chosen because my father said it looked good. The internships I'd suffered through because my mother said they'd build character. The family dinners where I'd smiled through criticisms dressed as concern, where I'd made myself smaller and quieter and more agreeable, hoping that eventually they'd see me as enough. They never had. And now I understood why. You can't see someone as enough when you're measuring their value in terms of what you can extract. My grandmother used to tell me that family isn't who you're born to, it's who shows up when the world falls apart. Dr. Reynolds had shown up. Grace had shown up. Aunt Helen and Marcus and even Vanessa, in her own fractured way, had shown up. My parents had shown up too, but only to stand over my grave and divide the inheritance. The silver bracelet on my wrist caught the light from the hallway. Aunt Helen had given it to me when I first woke up. It had been my grandmother's, a simple chain with a compass charm. Wherever you go, my grandmother used to say, make sure it's somewhere you chose. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that courtroom. Tomorrow, they'd see me alive when they'd been so certain I was finished. Tomorrow, I'd stop letting them choose for me. I touched the compass charm and felt it spin beneath my finger, needles seeking north. I was ready. The courthouse stood against a slate-gray sky, its stone columns darkened by rain that had started just after dawn. I arrived early with Marcus, both of us silent in his car as we pulled into the parking structure. My hands had stopped shaking somewhere around midnight. Now they felt steady, cold, purposeful. I wore a navy dress Aunt Helen had brought me, simple and professional, the kind of thing that said I was serious without trying too hard. The silver bracelet rested against my wrist bone, a quiet weight that reminded me why I was here. We walked through security, shoes squeaking on polished marble, and I caught sight of my reflection in the glass partition separating the metal detectors from the main hall. I looked thinner than I remembered, sharper somehow, like the months in that hospital bed had burned away everything soft and left only edges. My hair had grown past my shoulders, dark and unstyled, pulled back in a way that showed my face clearly. I wanted them to see my face. I wanted there to be no question that I was here, alive, awake, aware. Marcus touched my elbow gently as we approached the elevator. "You doing okay?" I nodded. "Better than okay. I feel clear." He studied me for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Good. Because they're going to try to rattle you. Remember what we talked about. Stay calm, answer only what's asked, and let the evidence speak." The elevator doors opened and we stepped inside. As we rose toward the third floor, I thought about all the times I'd imagined confronting my parents over the years. Small grievances, mostly. The way my mother would critique my clothes or career choices. The way my father would compare me unfavorably to Derek during holiday dinners. I'd rehearse speeches in my head, clever comebacks I'd never have the courage to deliver. But this wasn't about clever comebacks anymore. This was about documentation, timelines, bank transfers, sworn statements. This was about proof. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, paneled in dark wood with fluorescent lights that hummed faintly overhead. Rows of benches sat empty except for Aunt Helen in the back, her hands folded in her lap, and a young woman I didn't recognize with a notebook, probably a court reporter or law student observing. Marcus guided me to the plaintiff's table and we settled in, organizing folders and documents with the quiet efficiency of people who'd prepared for this moment. Then the door opened. My mother entered first, her posture rigid, chin lifted in that way she had when she was determined not to show weakness. She wore cream-colored slacks and a cashmere sweater, pearls at her throat, every inch the refined matriarch. Her eyes swept the room and landed on me. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Shock, maybe. Or recognition that this was really happening. Then the mask slid back into place and she looked away, taking her seat at the defendant's table as if I were a stranger. My father followed, moving slower, his face drawn. He'd aged in the months since I'd seen him last. New lines around his mouth, gray threading more heavily through his hair. He didn't look at me at all, just sat beside my mother and stared straight ahead at the judge's empty bench. Derek came last with their attorney, a sharp-featured woman in a black suit who exuded the kind of confidence that comes from never losing. Derek's eyes found mine and held for a moment. I saw guilt there, buried under layers of defensiveness, but guilt nonetheless. He looked away first. The bailiff entered. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Simmons." We stood as Judge Simmons took the bench, a woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair and the kind of face that had seen every variation of human behavior and wasn't impressed by any of it. She settled into her chair, adjusted her glasses, and reviewed the case file in front of her. "This is a petition to nullify a guardianship and recover assets allegedly misappropriated during the petitioner's incapacitation." She looked up at both tables. "Before we proceed, I want to make something clear. This is a civil matter, but the allegations are serious. I expect professionalism and truthfulness from all parties. Do I make myself understood?" A chorus of "Yes, Your Honor" from both sides. Judge Simmons nodded. "Counselor Chen, you may present your opening statement." Marcus stood, buttoning his jacket, and addressed the court with the calm precision I'd always admired. "Your Honor, This case is about a daughter who survived a catastrophic accident only to discover that her own family had used her incapacity as an opportunity for financial gain. While Natalie Harper lay in a coma, unable to speak or defend herself, her parents obtained emergency guardianship and systematically transferred her assets into their own control. They sold property that had been specifically bequeathed to her. They liquidated accounts she had built over years of work. They even attempted to discontinue her medical care against the advice of her physicians, a decision that would have resulted in her death and made their appropriation of her estate permanent. I watched my mother's face. Nothing. Not a flinch, not a blink. Marcus continued. We will demonstrate through financial records, medical documentation, and witness testimony that the defendants acted not in Miss Harper's best interest, but in their own. They moved with calculated speed to strip her of everything she owned while she was powerless to stop them. This isn't a case of difficult decisions made in good faith during a family crisis. This is exploitation, plain and simple, and we're here today to make it right. He sat down. Judge Simmons turned to the defense table. Ms. Brennan, your opening. The defense attorney stood with practiced grace. Your Honor, what my colleague describes as exploitation, we call love. The Harper family faced an unimaginable tragedy. Their daughter was in a coma with minimal brain activity and a prognosis that offered little hope of recovery. Faced with mounting medical bills and the very real possibility that Natalie would never regain consciousness, her parents made the difficult but responsible decision to secure her assets and manage her affairs. Every action they took was legally authorized under a court-granted guardianship. Every transfer was documented and proper. The fact that Miss Harper made a miraculous recovery doesn't transform prudent estate management into theft. She paused, letting her words settle. As for the DNR order, it was made in consultation with medical professionals and reflected what the family believed Natalie would have wanted. No one could have predicted she would wake up. And now that she has, instead of gratitude for the family that held her affairs together during the darkest time of her life, she's chosen litigation and accusation. This lawsuit isn't about justice, Your Honor. It's about resentment. Judge Simmons made a note. Call your first witness, Mr. Chen. Dr. Keisha Reynolds took the stand with the same steady presence she'd had in the ICU. She was sworn in, stated her credentials, and Marcus began his examination. Dr. Reynolds, you were the attending physician in charge of Natalie Harper's care during her coma. Can you describe her medical status during that time? Dr. Reynolds turned slightly toward the judge. Miss Harper suffered severe head trauma in the accident. She was placed in a medically induced coma initially to reduce brain swelling. Over the following weeks, we gradually reduced sedation to assess her neurological function. While she remained unresponsive in the traditional sense, her brain scans showed activity patterns inconsistent with a vegetative state. What does that mean in layman's terms? It means she was in there. Her brain was processing information at some level. We saw responses to external stimuli, changes in activity when spoken to, patterns that suggested awareness even without outward signs. Marcus pulled a document from his folder. I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit C, a DNR order dated June 15th. Do you recognize this? I do. This is the do not resuscitate order the Harper family requested. What was your response to that request? I opposed it. I told the family that while Miss Harper's prognosis was uncertain, there were clear signs of neurological improvement. I recommended continued life support and aggressive rehabilitation measures. They disagreed. Did they provide a reason for disagreeing? They said Natalie wouldn't want to live in a diminished state. That it would be cruel to keep her alive if she couldn't fully recover. Based on your medical assessment, was discontinuing life support medically indicated at that time? No. In my professional opinion, it was premature and not in the patient's best interest. I glanced at my mother. She sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table, her expression carefully neutral. My father shifted in his seat. Marcus continued. Did the family visit Miss Harper regularly during her hospitalization? Initially, yes. The first few weeks, they came daily. But as time went on, visits became less frequent. By the 5th month, I'd say they visited perhaps once every 2 weeks, usually briefly. Did you ever observe the family discussing financial matters in Miss Harper's presence? Dr. Reynolds hesitated, choosing her words carefully. On one occasion, I overheard Mrs. Harper and her son discussing property appraisals in the ICU waiting area. Another time, Mr. Harper was on the phone in Miss Harper's room discussing something about estate liquidity. I found it unusual given the circumstances, but family members often handle practical matters during medical crises. Thank you, doctor. No further questions. The defense attorney stood for cross-examination. Dr. Reynolds, you mentioned that the family initially visited frequently. Would you say their early behavior was consistent with loving, concerned parents? Yes, in the beginning they seemed very distressed. And the DNR request, while you disagreed with it medically, was it legally within their rights as guardians to make that request? Legally, yes. So despite your medical opinion, the family wasn't doing anything illegal. They simply had a different perspective on quality of life issues. Dr. Reynolds met her gaze evenly. A different perspective that would have resulted in their daughter's death and their inheritance of her estate, yes. The attorney's jaw tightened. No further questions. Judge Simmons called for a brief recess. I stood on shaking legs and followed Marcus into the hallway. Aunt Helen appeared at my side, pressing a bottle of water into my hands. You're doing great, she whispered. Just keep breathing. I drank the water mechanically, watching my parents through the courtroom doors. They stood in a tight cluster with their attorney, speaking in low, urgent tones. Derek kept running his hand through his hair, a nervous habit from childhood. My mother caught me watching and her eyes narrowed, just slightly, before she turned her back. When we reconvened, Marcus called Grace Okonkwo to the stand. She wore scrubs under a cardigan, clearly coming straight from a shift. After being sworn in, she confirmed her role as night nurse in the ICU during my stay. Ms. Okonkwo, did you ever hear members of the Harper family discuss financial matters while visiting Natalie? Grace nodded, her expression troubled. Several times. Once I heard Mrs. Harper and her son, Derek I believe, discussing selling a house. They were talking about square footage and market value. Another time, Mr. Harper was on his phone in the hallway talking about transferring funds from some kind of investment account. Did they seem concerned about being overheard? No. They spoke at normal volume. I got the impression they didn't think it mattered what they said in front of Natalie because they believed she couldn't hear them. In your professional experience as a nurse, do you believe coma patients can hear and process what's said around them? I do. Not always, and not in every case, but there's enough research and anecdotal evidence that I always talk to my coma patients as if they can understand me. I encourage families to do the same, to be careful what they say. Thank you. No further questions. The defense attorney declined to cross-examine, probably recognizing that attacking a sympathetic nurse wouldn't play well. Instead, she called my father to the stand. He walked slowly to the witness box, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on the Bible. After being sworn in, he sat with his shoulders hunched, looking smaller than I remembered. Mr. Harper, the defense attorney began, can you describe your relationship with your daughter before the accident? Vincent Harper cleared his throat. Natalie was always headstrong. Independent. She wanted to pursue art and design instead of more traditional career paths. We had our disagreements, but I loved her. When she was hurt, it devastated our family. When you obtained guardianship, what was your intention? To protect her. The medical bills were astronomical. Her business was failing without her there to run it. We were trying to preserve what we could so that if she did recover, she'd have something to come back to. Did you profit personally from any of the asset transfers? No. Everything went into family trusts and estate accounts meant to benefit the whole family, including Natalie. Marcus stood for cross-examination, and I saw something shift in his posture, a sharpening. Mr. Harper, you testified that you were trying to preserve Natalie's assets. Is that correct? Yes. Then can you explain why you transferred the deed to her grandmother's house into a trust you control rather than simply maintaining it in her name? My father shifted. We thought it would be easier to manage that way. Easier for whom? For everyone. The property needed maintenance, taxes had to be paid. Marcus pulled out a document. I'm showing you Exhibit J, an email you sent to a real estate agent on July 3rd. Can you read the highlighted portion for the court? My father's face went pale. He looked at the paper, then at the judge. It says, we'd like to list the property as soon as the estate issues are finalized. We're hoping for a quick sale to avoid the fall market slowdown. That's less than 4 months after your daughter's accident. Does that sound like preservation or liquidation? We needed the funds for her medical care. Marcus pulled another document. According to these hospital billing records, Natalie's insurance covered 85% of her care, and the hospital had agreed to a payment plan for the remainder. The amount owed was approximately $40,000. The house you were planning to sell was valued at $375,000. That's quite a discrepancy, isn't it? My father said nothing. Let me ask you directly, Mr. Harper. When you signed the DNR order, did you believe Natalie would die? His voice came out barely above a whisper. The doctors said her chances were very slim. And if she died, you would inherit her estate. Correct? Along with the rest of the family, yes. Including the house, the life insurance money, and the investment accounts you'd already transferred into your control. We were trying to do the right thing. Marcus leaned forward slightly. The right thing for whom, Mr. Harper? Because from where I'm standing, every action you took benefited you financially and left your daughter with nothing. Objection, argumentative, the defense attorney called out. Sustained, Judge Simmons said, but I could see the question had landed. No further questions. When my father stepped down, he couldn't look at me. He returned to his seat beside my mother, who reached over and squeezed his hand once, a gesture that might have looked supportive if you didn't notice how quickly she let go. The defense called Derek next. My brother took the stand with visible reluctance, his eyes darting between the judge, the attorneys, and anywhere but me. Mr. Harper, the defense attorney began, you helped your parents manage your sister's affairs during her incapacity. Can you tell the court why you did that? Derek cleared his throat. Someone had to. Natalie didn't have anyone else. No spouse, no power of attorney in place. Mom and Dad were overwhelmed, and I thought I could help shoulder some of the burden. Did you personally benefit from any of the financial transfers? Not directly, no. I mean, I'm part of the family trust, so eventually I suppose, but that wasn't the motivation. What was the motivation? Taking care of family. Making sure nothing fell through the cracks. Marcus stood for his cross-examination with a thin smile. Mr. Harper, you testified you didn't benefit directly. But you did receive a $10,000 transfer from the estate account in August. What was that for? Derek hesitated. That was reimbursement for expenses I incurred managing Natalie's affairs. Legal fees, travel to the hospital, that sort of thing. $10,000 in legal fees and gas money? There were other costs. I had to take time off work. Your employer is your father's company, correct? The same company where you're listed as vice president? Yes. So you took time off from the family business to manage your sister's assets, and then reimbursed yourself from her accounts. It was all documented. I'm sure it was. Marcus pulled yet another document from his seemingly endless supply. I'm showing you a text message exchange between you and your father dated June 20th. Can you read the highlighted portion? Derek's face flushed. It says, once everything is settled, we should be able to cover the kitchen renovation and maybe the lake house down payment. What does once everything is settled mean? I don't know. I was just thinking out loud. You were thinking out loud about spending your comatose sister's inheritance on home improvements. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean, Mr. Harper? Derek's composure cracked. Look, I know how this looks, okay? But we didn't think she was waking up. The doctors said it was unlikely. We were just trying to make practical decisions. Practical for whom? Derek went quiet. "Let me ask you something else," Marcus continued, his voice gentler now. "Did you love your sister?" "Of course I did." "Did you visit her in the hospital?" "Yes." "Not as much toward the end, but yes." "Did you ever sit with her? Talk to her? Read to her?" Derek's eyes finally found mine across the courtroom, and what I saw there wasn't malice. It was shame. "No," he admitted quietly. I didn't know what to say. Marcus nodded slowly. No further questions. The rest of the afternoon blurred together. Witness after witness, document after document, a slow accumulation of evidence that painted a picture clearer than any single testimony could. Vanessa's records showed systematic transfers. The real estate agent confirmed discussions about selling the house well before my recovery. An estate attorney testified that my parents had consulted about dissolving my business and distributing assets to family members. Through it all, my mother sat motionless, her face betraying nothing. She didn't testify. The defense attorney advised against it, probably recognizing that Caroline Harper's cold composure wouldn't play well to a judge already skeptical of their narrative. As the afternoon light faded outside the tall courtroom windows, Judge Simmons called for final arguments. Marcus stood first, his voice measured and clear. "Your Honor, the evidence shows a pattern of self-dealing and financial exploitation that began within days of Miss Harper's hospitalization. This wasn't a family making difficult decisions in good faith. This was a family seizing an opportunity. They moved quickly to secure guardianship, faster to liquidate assets, and when medical professionals recommended continued care, they pushed for a DNR order that would have made their inheritance permanent. The only thing they didn't count on was Natalie waking up. And now that she has, they're asking this court to validate what they did while she was helpless to stop them. We're asking for justice. For the return of her property, her accounts, and her dignity." The defense attorney stood, her expression grave. "Your Honor, hindsight is 20/20. It's easy now, knowing that Miss Harper recovered, to second-guess every decision her family made. But at the time, they were facing an impossible situation. A daughter in a coma, mounting bills, no clear path forward. They did what they thought was necessary, and they did it legally under a valid guardianship. To now punish them for making hard choices during a crisis would be unjust. We ask that you uphold the guardianship actions as proper and dismiss this petition." Judge Simmons removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "I'll need time to review all the evidence and testimony. This court is adjourned. I'll issue my ruling within 10 business days." The gavel came down. People began to gather their things, conversations starting in hushed tones. I sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, suddenly exhausted, as if every ounce of energy that had carried me through the day had evaporated with that final gavel strike. Marcus touched my shoulder. "You did good. Really good." I nodded but couldn't find words. Aunt Helen appeared, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like lavender and coffee. As we turned to leave, I saw my parents standing by their table, speaking urgently with their attorney. Derek stood apart, staring at the floor. Then my father looked up. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and for just a moment, I saw him really see me. Not as an inconvenience or an asset or a problem to manage, but as his daughter who had just laid bare every betrayal in a court of law. His face crumpled. He grabbed the edge of the table as if his legs had given out, and my mother reached for him, her composure finally cracking as she tried to steady him. Derek rushed over, helping lower him into a chair. The bailiff moved toward them, asking if they needed medical assistance. My father waved him off, but he looked gray, diminished, like the weight of what they'd done had finally become too heavy to carry standing up. I should have felt triumphant. Vindicated. Something. Instead, I felt hollowed out, scraped clean. Marcus guided me toward the exit. "Let's get you out of here." In the hallway, Aunt Helen held my arm as we walked to the elevator. Several people from the courtroom stared as we passed, their expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity to judgment. I kept my eyes forward and my breathing steady. The elevator doors closed on the courthouse, on my parents, on the whole wretched afternoon. As we descended, I leaned against the cool metal wall and closed my eyes. "It's over," Aunt Helen said softly. But it wasn't. Not yet. The judge still had to rule. My parents still had my grandmother's house. The money was still frozen in accounts I couldn't access. And somewhere between the third floor and the ground, I realized that even if I won every dollar back, even if the court ruled in my favor on every single point, there was something I'd never recover. The version of myself that had believed, deep down, that family meant safety. That blood meant loyalty. That the people who raised you would protect you when the world tried to break you down. That girl had died in the ICU. Not from the accident, but from what came after. From the voices discussing property values while she lay paralyzed and screaming inside her own body. From the signature on a DNR order that valued convenience over her life. The elevator opened to the lobby. Rain had started again, turning the evening streets into sheets of reflected light. Marcus offered to drive me back to the rehab facility, but I shook my head. "I want to walk for a bit." "Natalie, it's pouring," Aunt Helen protested. "I know. I just need air." They exchanged a look but didn't argue. Marcus handed me his umbrella and made me promise to call when I got back. Then they left me standing under the courthouse overhang, watching the rain come down in waves. I opened the umbrella and stepped into it. The cold shocked my skin awake, sharpened everything. I walked without direction, letting my feet carry me through the Pearl District, past restaurants beginning their dinner service, past boutiques closing for the evening, past people hurrying home under inadequate jackets and newspapers held over their heads. Eventually I found myself at the waterfront, at the park where the Willamette River ran dark and fast beneath the bridges. I stood at the railing, rain drumming against the umbrella, and watched the water move. Somewhere upstream was the hospital where I'd spent 8 months trapped in my own body. Somewhere behind me was the courthouse where I'd just watched my family's true nature laid bare in legal documents and sworn testimony. And somewhere ahead was whatever came next. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Judge wants to see us tomorrow morning. She's issuing her ruling early." My hands tightened on the railing. Tomorrow. One way or another, tomorrow I'd know if truth mattered more than blood. If being right was enough to make things right. I typed back. "I'll be there." The river kept moving, indifferent to courtrooms and family betrayals and girls who'd come back from the dead. I watched it for a long time, until the cold seeped through my coat and my fingers went numb on the umbrella handle. Then I turned and walked back into the city, toward whatever tomorrow would bring. The morning arrived wrapped in fog that turned Portland into something from a dream, buildings emerging half-formed from the gray. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling of my rehab room, tracing water stains and trying not to think about what the judge's early ruling meant. Early could mean she'd found the case straightforward. It could also mean she wanted to end this quickly before it consumed more court resources. Marcus had texted at 6 a.m. to say he'd pick me up at 8:30, which gave me 2 hours to shower, dress, and pretend I had an appetite for the breakfast that sat untouched on the tray beside my bed. Aunt Helen arrived at 7:45 with coffee and a bag from the bakery down the street. She didn't ask if I was nervous. She just sat beside me on the narrow bed and held my hand while we watched the fog begin to lift outside the window, revealing the city piece by piece. "Whatever happens today," she said quietly, "you've already won something they can never take back." "What's that?" "Your voice. You stood up and you spoke. That matters." I wanted to believe her. But sitting there in that institutional room with its beige walls and smell of disinfectant, all I could think about was my grandmother's house with its wide windows and the studio where light came in sideways through the skylight. I thought about the investment account I'd built by taking every small freelance job I could find, saving instead of spending, planning for a future I thought I had time to build. I thought about standing in that courtroom yesterday and watching my father's face crumble, and how even that moment of recognition hadn't felt like victory. It had just felt sad. Marcus arrived exactly on time, his suit pressed, his face carefully neutral in that way lawyers have when they're managing their own anxiety. We drove to the courthouse in silence broken only by the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers clearing away remnants of morning mist. The parking structure was nearly empty this early, our footsteps echoing as we made our way to the elevator. Inside the courthouse, everything felt different from yesterday. Quieter. The hallways weren't filled with people rushing between courtrooms. The security guard nodded at us as we passed through the metal detectors, his expression sympathetic in a way that made my stomach tighten. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked down the corridor to Judge Simmons's courtroom. The door was already open. My parents were there. Of course they were. They sat on the same bench they'd occupied yesterday, my mother's posture as rigid as ever, my father looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. Derek sat apart from them, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Their attorney stood near the defendant's table, speaking quietly into her phone. She glanced up when we entered, her expression unreadable. We took our seats at the plaintiff's table. Marcus arranged his folders with unnecessary precision, a tell I'd learned to recognize. He was worried. I touched the compass bracelet on my wrist, feeling its weight, and tried to remember how to breathe. The bailiff entered. All rise. Judge Simmons took the bench with the same no-nonsense efficiency she'd shown throughout the proceedings. She settled into her chair, opened a folder, and looked out at both tables with an expression that gave away nothing. Good morning. I've reviewed all testimony and evidence presented yesterday, and I've reached a decision. Before I deliver my ruling, I want to address something directly. She paused, her gaze moving between my parents and me. This case represents a fundamental breach of trust within a family. Regardless of my legal findings, that breach will have consequences that extend far beyond this courtroom. I say this not to lecture, but to remind everyone present that the law can address financial wrongs, but it cannot repair relationships. What you do with that reality is up to you. She looked down at her notes. Now, to the matter at hand. The petitioner, Natalie Harper, seeks to nullify a guardianship and recover assets transferred during her period of incapacitation. The respondents argue that all actions taken were legally proper and in the petitioner's best interest. Having considered the evidence, I find as follows. My heart hammered against my ribs. First, regarding the guardianship itself. The court finds that the emergency guardianship was properly granted given the circumstances. Miss Harper was incapacitated, and her parents had legal standing to petition for authority to manage her affairs. However, the standard for maintaining such a guardianship requires that the guardian act in the ward's best interest. This is a fiduciary duty, one of the highest standards of care recognized in law. She turned a page. The evidence presented shows that the respondents moved with unusual speed to liquidate the petitioner's assets and transfer property into their own control. While they argue this was necessary for financial management, the timeline and nature of the transfers suggest a different motive. Emails discussing home renovations and property sales, transfers that benefited the respondents personally, and the attempt to discontinue life support against medical advice all paint a picture of self-dealing rather than fiduciary care. I saw my mother's hand tighten on the armrest beside her. Most troubling is the DNR order. Dr. Reynolds's testimony was credible and compelling. She clearly articulated that Miss Harper showed signs of neurological improvement and that discontinuing life support was medically premature. The respondents chose to override this medical advice, a decision that would have resulted in the petitioner's death and the immediate inheritance of her estate. While I cannot definitively prove their motive was financial, the timing and circumstances create a strong inference. Judge Simmons looked directly at my parents. In light of these findings, I hereby nullify the guardianship retroactively from the date it was granted. All transfers made under the authority of that guardianship are voided. The deed to the property located at 427 Scenic Drive is to be returned to Miss Harper's name within 30 days. All funds transferred from her accounts, including the life insurance proceeds, are to be restored with interest calculated from the date of transfer. The courtroom seemed to contract around those words. Returned. Restored. Voided. Furthermore, Judge Simmons continued, I am awarding Miss Harper damages in the amount of $50,000 to compensate for the emotional distress, loss of use of her property, and the violation of fiduciary duty. The respondents are also ordered to pay all court costs and attorney fees associated with this litigation. Marcus exhaled slowly beside me. I sat frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. I want to be clear, the judge said, her voice harder now. What happened here was a profound betrayal. The law provides remedies for financial wrongs, and I have applied those remedies. But no court order can undo the damage done to this family. I hope, for all your sakes, that you find a way to reckon with that. She closed her folder. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a finality that seemed to echo in my chest. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then my mother stood abruptly, her face pale, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. My father remained seated, his head in his hands. Derek finally looked up, his eyes finding mine across the room. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it and looked away. Their attorney gathered her materials with quick, efficient movements, leaning down to say something to my father before following my mother out. That left just Derek and my father on their bench, and Marcus, Aunt Helen, and me on ours. Marcus touched my arm gently. Natalie, we won. Do you understand? You won. I nodded, but the word felt strange. Won. As if there was a prize at the end of all this beyond getting back what had always been mine. As if victory could fill the space where a family used to be. We stood to leave. As we passed the defendant's table, my father looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face haggard. For a moment we just stared at each other, and I waited for him to say something. An apology, an explanation, anything. Instead, he looked down again. And we walked past. In the hallway, Aunt Helen wrapped me in a hug that smelled like her perfume and coffee and safety. You did it, sweetheart. You fought and you won. Over her shoulder, I saw Derek emerge from the courtroom. He stopped when he saw us, uncertainty written across his face. For a second I thought he might approach. Then Vanessa appeared from around the corner, probably having waited outside during the ruling. She went straight to him, said something I couldn't hear, and they walked away together in the opposite direction. Marcus was on his phone, already talking to someone about the mechanics of executing the court's order. 30 days to restore the deed, immediate release of frozen funds, coordination with the estate attorney to ensure compliance. The practical machinery of justice grinding into motion. I excused myself and found the restroom, needing a moment alone. Inside, I gripped the edge of the sink and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was thinner than I remembered, her cheekbones sharp, her eyes holding something I didn't quite recognize. Not triumph. Not even relief. Just a kind of hard-won clarity. I won. The house would be returned. The money would be restored. My parents had been held accountable for what they'd done. Everything the court could fix, it had fixed. So why did I feel so empty? The bathroom door opened and an older woman in a business suit entered, offering me a sympathetic smile before disappearing into a stall. I splashed cold water on my face, dried it with rough paper towels, and headed back to the hallway. Marcus was off the phone. He briefed me on next steps while we walked to the elevator. We'd need to file paperwork with the county recorder's office, coordinate with the bank to re-establish my accounts, meet with a financial advisor to assess what had been spent and what could be recovered. The legal process would continue for weeks, maybe months, even though the ruling was final. Do you want to go see it? Aunt Helen asked as we stepped outside into morning light that had finally burned through the fog. The house? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to go immediately, to walk through those rooms and reclaim them. But another part knew that seeing it now, before the deed was officially transferred back, would feel like visiting something that still belonged to someone else. Not yet, I said. Soon, but not yet. We drove back to the rehab facility in Aunt Helen's car, Marcus following in his own to drop off some paperwork before heading to his office. The radio played softly, some jazz station Helen favored, and I watched the city pass outside the window. People going about their Tuesday mornings, buying coffee, walking dogs, completely unaware that in a courtroom 3 miles away, A judge had just ruled that families could betray you but the law could make them pay. At the facility, Aunt Helen walked me up to my room. She lingered in the doorway, clearly not wanting to leave me alone. "I'm okay," I told her. "Really?" She studied my face. "You don't have to be okay yet, you know. What you've been through, it's monumental. Give yourself time to feel whatever you feel." After she left, I sat on the edge of my bed and finally let myself cry. Not the dramatic sobbing you see in movies, just quiet tears that came without warning and left me feeling wrung out and somehow lighter. I cried for the grandmother who'd tried to protect me even after death. I cried for the version of my family I'd once believed in, the one that had never really existed. I cried because I'd won and it hurt just as much as losing would have. Eventually the tears stopped. I washed my face again, changed into comfortable clothes, and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of the day. Physical therapy wasn't until 3. Marcus would call with updates as things progressed. For the first time in months, I had hours ahead of me with no medical procedures, no court dates, no immediate crisis demanding attention. I pulled out my laptop, the same one I'd used to run my graphic design business before the accident. I hadn't opened it since waking up, afraid of what I'd find. How many client emails had gone unanswered? How many projects had I abandoned midstream? Derek had closed the business, dissolved the LLC, sent form letters to my clients explaining I was unavailable. But my files would still be there, years of work, projects I'd loved, designs I'd been proud of. The desktop loaded, familiar and strange at once. My last project was still open, a logo design for a coffee shop in Northwest Portland. I remembered working on it the morning of the accident, tweaking the curve of a letter, adjusting colors. I'd been planning to send the final proof that afternoon. Instead, I'd gotten in my car and driven into an intersection where a truck was running a red light. I closed the file without saving it. That project belonged to a different person, one who'd thought the biggest challenge ahead was choosing between 2 shades of teal. In my downloads folder, I found something unexpected. A folder labeled for Future Nat, created about a year before the accident. I didn't remember making it. Curious, I opened it. Inside were screenshots of inspiration, quotes I'd saved, photos of designs I wanted to try. But at the bottom was a document simply titled "If you're reading this." I opened it. The words on the screen were in my own voice, written to myself, though I had no memory of typing them. "Hey future me. I'm writing this on a night when I feel like giving up. Mom made another comment about my career choices today. Dad asked when I was going to get serious about life. Derek implied I was wasting my potential. And I'm sitting here wondering if they're right. If I'm delusional for thinking I can make this work. So I'm writing this for you, future Nat, in case you need the reminder. You are good at this. You are building something real. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Not them, not clients, not the little voice in your head that sounds suspiciously like Dad. Keep going. You've got this." I stared at the screen for a long time. Past me had written to future me, not knowing that future would include a coma, a betrayal, a courtroom battle. But the message still landed. Keep going. You've got this. I created a new folder. Called it New Start. And inside it, I began to brainstorm. Not about graphic design or freelance work or rebuilding what I'd lost. About what came next. What did I actually want to create now that I'd survived what should have killed me? An idea had been forming in the back of my mind for weeks, since those first conversations with Dr. Reynolds about patient advocacy. How many people in comas had families making decisions against their best interest? How many had no one fighting for them the way Dr. Reynolds had fought for me? What if there was an organization dedicated to that, to being the voice for patients who couldn't speak for themselves? I started typing. Rough notes at first, questions more than answers. What would such an organization look like? Who would staff it? How would it be funded? What legal authority would it have? The questions multiplied, but underneath them was something solid, a sense of purpose that felt different from anything I'd experienced before the accident. My phone rang. Marcus. I answered. Good news, he said. I just got off the phone with your parents' attorney. They're not going to appeal. They're going to comply with the court order voluntarily and expediently. I let that sink in. So it's really over. The legal fight? Yes. Everything else? That's up to you. After we hung up, I sat with that thought. Everything else was up to me. What to do with the house. Whether to ever speak to my parents again. How to rebuild a life that had been interrupted so violently. Those were decisions only I could make, and for the first time, I had the space and resources to make them deliberately. Over the next week, things began to move quickly. The deed transfer was processed in 12 days instead of 30, my parents apparently eager to complete their obligations and close this chapter. My bank accounts were restored, though seeing the balances after the funds were returned felt surreal, like finding money in a coat pocket you'd forgotten about, except multiplied by thousands. The life insurance money, the investment accounts, everything back where it belonged. Marcus arranged for the damage payment to be deposited separately. $50,000 for emotional distress and fiduciary breach. I stared at the number on the bank statement and felt nothing. How do you quantify the value of trust? What's the going rate for a family's betrayal? I decided to put that money toward the patient advocacy idea. If it came from pain, it should go toward preventing someone else's. 2 weeks after the ruling, Marcus called to tell me the house keys were ready. My parents had cleared out completely, taking only what was definitively theirs. Everything my grandmother had left, the furniture, the dishes, the art on the walls, remained. Do you want me to go with you? Aunt Helen offered when I told her I was planning to visit. I shook my head. I think I need to do this alone. The house sat on a quiet street in the West Hills, surrounded by Douglas firs and maples that turned the light green even at midday. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, just looking at it. Craftsman style, dark wood and river rock, a wide porch with 2 rocking chairs I'd sat in countless times with my grandmother. The garden was overgrown, rhododendrons blooming wild, the grass higher than she would have tolerated. But it was still beautiful, still whole. I got out of the car slowly, my legs still not quite steady after months of limited use. The physical therapist said I was making remarkable progress, that most people in my situation would take a year or more to regain full mobility. I'd done it in 3 months through sheer stubborn determination. But climbing the porch steps still took effort, each one a small victory. The key fit perfectly in the lock. The door swung open on hinges that needed oil, releasing air that smelled like dust in closed spaces and faintly, impossibly, like my grandmother's lavender sachets. Inside, everything was exactly as I remembered and completely different. The furniture sat in the same positions, the rug in the living room still bore the faint wine stain from a dinner party years ago, the piano against the far wall held the same accumulation of framed photos. But the air felt static, abandoned. This wasn't a home anymore. It was a museum of what had been. I walked through each room slowly, reacquainting myself with spaces that had once been as familiar as my own skin. The kitchen where my grandmother had taught me to make pie crust, her hands guiding mine as we cut butter into flour. The dining room where we'd had long conversations about art and meaning and what it meant to build a life that mattered. The studio upstairs where she'd encouraged my early design work, where the skylight still let in that perfect sideways light. In her bedroom, I found her reading glasses still on the nightstand beside a book she'd been reading when she died. I picked up the glasses carefully, as if they might crumble, and something in my chest cracked open. This was what they'd tried to take. Not just property or money, but this connection, these memories, this proof that I'd been loved unconditionally by at least one person. I sat on the edge of her bed and let myself remember. How she'd always taken my side, even when I was clearly wrong. How she'd believed in my potential when everyone else saw only my shortcomings. How she'd made sure I'd have something solid to stand on by leaving me this house, this foundation. And how my parents had tried to erase all of it while I lay dying. The anger I'd been holding at bay for weeks finally rose up, hot and clarifying. Not the cold strategic anger that had fueled the lawsuit, but something rawer. I wanted to scream at them, to demand they explain how they could look at me in that hospital bed and see only an inconvenience. I wanted to understand what had broken in them that made taking my inheritance seem reasonable, logical, even kind. But more than anger, I felt grief. Grief for the parents I'd needed and never had. Grief for the family I'd imagined we were. Grief for my grandmother, who died believing her gift would protect me, not knowing it would become the thing they'd fight over while I couldn't defend myself. I cried there in that silent house until the tears ran dry and left behind something clearer. I couldn't make them into the parents I'd needed. I couldn't go back and change how they'd treated me, before or after the accident. But I could decide what to do with what remained. I could turn this house into something that mattered. I could use my grandmother's gift the way she'd intended, as a foundation to build from. I could take everything they'd tried to steal and make it mean something beyond revenge or restitution. I stood, wiped my face, and walked to the studio upstairs. The space was exactly as I'd left it. My drafting table against the window, colored pencils still in their jar, sketches pinned to the wall from projects I'd abandoned when the accident happened. I pulled down the old sketches and began to envision something new. This room could be an office. The dining room downstairs could host meetings. The living room could be a waiting area for clients. The house my grandmother left me could become the headquarters for the organization I was starting to build. A place where patients and families could come for advocacy, for support, for someone to fight for them the way Dr. Reynolds had fought for me. I pulled out my phone and called Marcus. I need your help with something new. What kind of something? I want to start a nonprofit. Patient advocacy, medical ethics, supporting people who can't speak for themselves. He was quiet for a moment. That's a big undertaking. I know. But I've got the house, the settlement money, and nothing but time. Plus I've got first-hand experience with what happens when patients don't have advocates. When do you want to start? Today. Right now. Tell me what paperwork I need. We spent the next hour on the phone while I wandered through the house, Marcus explaining the process of establishing a nonprofit, applying for tax-exempt status, creating a board of directors. I took notes on my phone, ideas flowing faster than I could type. Dr. Reynolds would be perfect for the medical advisory board. Grace could help with training volunteers on patient communication. Aunt Helen knew people in the legal community who might want to serve. By the time we hung up, I had the skeleton of a plan and the beginning of something that felt like purpose. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning. Opening windows to let fresh air replace the staleness, wiping down surfaces, sweeping floors. The physical work felt good, grounding. Each room I cleared felt like reclaiming not just space but possibility. As the light began to fade, I stood on the porch and looked out at the overgrown garden. Tomorrow I'd hire someone to help with the yard. Next week I'd start interviewing contractors about converting the house for organizational use while keeping its character intact. Next month I'd file the nonprofit paperwork and begin recruiting board members. But tonight, I just stood in the home my grandmother had loved enough to protect for me, feeling her presence in the grain of the wood and the creak of the floorboards and the way the evening light came through the trees. Thank you, I whispered to the empty air. Thank you for believing I was worth fighting for. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing, and I let myself believe she heard. 3 months passed before my mother reached out. Not through a phone call or a letter, but through Derek, who showed up at the house on a Saturday morning while I was meeting with the contractor about converting the second bedroom into a consultation space. He stood on the porch looking uncomfortable, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, the October wind scattering leaves around his feet. "Can we talk?" he asked when I opened the door. "Just for a few minutes." I considered saying no. The nonprofit paperwork had been filed, Dr. Reynolds and 2 other medical professionals had agreed to serve on the advisory board, and I'd spent the past weeks building something that felt clean and purposeful. Derek showing up felt like mud tracked across a freshly cleaned floor. But curiosity won out, or maybe just the need to see what he wanted now that there was nothing left to take. I stepped onto the porch, leaving the door open behind me so the contractor could still call if he needed me. We stood at opposite ends, the rocking chairs between us like a buffer. "Mom wants to see you," Derek said, getting straight to it. She's been asking me to reach out for weeks. And Dad? He looked away. Dad's not doing well. The stress of everything, it triggered some heart issues. He's been in and out of the hospital. I waited for the guilt to hit, the automatic concern for a parent's health. It didn't come. Instead, I just felt tired. What does she want? To talk. To explain. I don't know, maybe to apologize. She could have called me herself. Derek shifted his weight. You know Mom. She doesn't do anything directly if she can help it. Plus I think she's afraid you'll hang up on her. Would I be wrong to? He met my eyes then. No. You wouldn't be wrong. What they did, what we did, it was indefensible. I'd been going to therapy trying to understand how I convinced myself it was okay. My therapist says I was prioritizing family loyalty over individual morality, which is just a fancy way of saying I was a coward who went along with something horrible because it was easier than standing up to them. The honesty caught me off guard. This wasn't the defensive Derek from the courtroom or the golden child who'd always known which side his bread was buttered on. This was someone who'd actually looked at himself and hadn't liked what he saw. How's Vanessa? I asked. She's good. Angry at me, but good. She's actually been pushing me to do this, to try to make things right somehow. She said if I don't at least try, she's not sure she can stay married to someone who'd abandon his sister like that. Smart woman. Yeah. He smiled weakly. Too smart for me, probably. We stood in silence for a moment, the wind moving through the trees with that particular sound of autumn, dry and rustling. I thought about what Dr. Reynolds had said to me during one of our follow-up appointments. You get to decide what forgiveness looks like for you. It doesn't have to mean reconciliation. It doesn't have to mean letting them back into your life. It just means choosing not to let what they did keep poisoning you. Tell Mom I'll meet her, I said finally. But not here. And not at their house. Somewhere neutral. Derek nodded quickly. I'll set it up. Maybe that coffee place on 23rd? Fine. Next Saturday. 10 a.m. And Derek? I'm doing this once. If she's looking for absolution or wants to pretend everything's fine now, she can save both our time. Understood. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Natalie, I'm proud of what you're building here. The nonprofit. It's more than any of us ever did. After he left, I went back inside where the contractor was measuring windows for new coverings. The house was coming together slowly, transforming from a residential space into something more functional without losing the warmth my grandmother had built into it. The studio upstairs would remain largely unchanged, a space for art therapy sessions we planned to offer. The living room was being fitted with comfortable seating and sound-dampening panels for private conversations. The dining room would house a small library of medical advocacy resources. I'd hired Grace part-time to help develop training materials for volunteers. Dr. Reynolds came by twice a week to consult on medical protocols and ethical guidelines. Aunt Helen had connected me with a lawyer who specialized in healthcare law and was willing to serve on the board pro bono. Piece by piece, something real was taking shape. The following Saturday arrived cold and sharp, the kind of morning where your breath clouds in front of your face and the sun feels like a suggestion rather than a certainty. I dressed carefully, choosing jeans and a sweater that felt like armor without looking like I was trying. The compass bracelet went on my wrist, as it did every morning now, a reminder of direction chosen rather than assigned. The coffee shop was crowded, filled with people ordering elaborate drinks and working on laptops, the air thick with the smell of espresso and cinnamon. I arrived 5 minutes early and claimed a table in the back corner where we'd have some privacy. At exactly 10, my mother walked through the door. She looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner. Her clothes hung differently, like she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her hair was still perfectly styled, her makeup still flawlessly applied, but underneath it all, she looked diminished. She spotted me and made her way through the crowd, moving carefully as if unsure of her welcome. Natalie, she said, stopping at the edge of the table. Mom. Sit down. She did, folding her hands on the table in front of her, the same gesture she'd used in the courtroom. For a moment, neither of us spoke. A barista called out someone's name, and a teenager laughed too loudly near the window. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," she began, her voice measured. "I know I don't deserve your time. You don't. But I'm here anyway. Say what you came to say." She took a breath, and I watched her arrange her thoughts the way she'd taught me to arrange flowers, everything carefully positioned to create the right impression. I'd been doing a lot of thinking since the trial. About the choices we made, the choices I made, and how we justified them to ourselves. And I was wrong. She said it simply, without the elaborate explanations I'd expected. We were wrong. I can give you reasons, try to explain the fear and the pressure and how your father and I convinced ourselves we were being practical, but none of it excuses what we did. No, it doesn't. You were my daughter, and I should have fought for you. Instead, I saw you lying there and I saw problems. Medical bills, legal complications, disruption to our lives. I didn't see you. I saw everything you represented as an obligation, and I resented it. The honesty was more brutal than any apology. Part of me had wanted her to make excuses so I could reject them. This raw admission left me with nothing to push against. "When did you stop seeing me as a person?" I asked quietly. "Was it after the accident, or before?" She flinched. "That's a fair question. I think it happened gradually, years before the accident. You were always so different from what I understood. Derek made sense to me. He wanted the things we valued, success and stability and respect. But you wanted to create art, to build something meaningful rather than profitable. It scared me because I didn't know how to protect you in that world. So you decided I needed to be changed instead of protected." "Yes. And when you wouldn't change, when you kept choosing your own path despite everything we said, I stopped trying to understand. I just wrote you off as someone who'd made bad choices and would suffer the consequences. Then when you were in that coma, it felt like those consequences had arrived. And instead of recognizing how horrible that was, I used it as an opportunity to prove I'd been right all along about you needing someone else to manage your life. I absorbed this, turning it over like a stone with sharp edges. You signed a DNR order," I said. "You were going to let me die." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Yes." "Why?" "Because if you died, all the problems would be solved. No more medical bills, no more waiting, no more uncertainty. Your father and I could grieve properly and move on, and we'd have the resources from your estate to stabilize our own finances, which were worse than you knew." It was monstrous. I know that now. But at the time, I convinced myself it was mercy. Mercy for whom? For all of us. Including you. I actually believed you'd be better off not waking up to a diminished life. She wiped at her eyes with a napkin, her carefully applied makeup beginning to smudge. The judge was right. What we did was a profound betrayal. And I don't know how to fix it. You can't, I said flatly. What's broken can't be put back together the same way. You can acknowledge it was broken. You can take responsibility for breaking it. But you can't fix it. She nodded slowly. I understand. I'm not here asking you to forgive me or to let me back into your life. I just needed you to know that I see what I did. I see you now, maybe for the first time in years, and I'm ashamed of how long it took. A young couple sat down at the table next to us, laughing about something on one of their phones, completely unaware that 2 feet away a mother was confessing to her daughter that she'd valued convenience over her life. The juxtaposition felt surreal. Dad's heart problems, I said. Are they serious? He had a minor cardiac event last month. The doctors say it was stress-related, probably exacerbated by everything that happened. He's on medication now, making lifestyle changes. But yes, it scared him. Scared both of us. Is that why you're here? Because he had a health scare and suddenly mortality feels real? Partly, she admitted. But also because Vanessa showed me something. She brought over some photos from when you were little, pictures I'd packed away years ago. You at your first art show in elementary school, you with your grandmother in her studio, you on your 10th birthday holding that camera she gave you. And I realized I'd erased you long before the accident. I'd stopped seeing those photos because they reminded me that you'd always been exactly who you were, and I'd spent years trying to make you into someone else. I felt something crack in my chest, not breaking but shifting. This was what I'd needed to hear, not just that she was sorry, but that she understood the scope of what had been lost. Not just the house or the money, but years of being seen and valued for who I actually was. I'm building something, I told her. A nonprofit for patient advocacy. Using grandmother's house as the headquarters. Derek mentioned that. It sounds important. It is. To me, and hopefully to the people it helps. I'm not doing it for recognition or to prove anything to you and Dad. I'm doing it because I know what it's like to be voiceless and I want to make sure other people have someone in their corner. Your grandmother would be proud. Yeah, she would. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. I don't know if there's a relationship to rebuild here, Mom. I don't know if I want to try. But I can tell you that I'm not carrying anger anymore. I was, for a while. I wanted you to suffer the way I suffered. But anger takes too much energy, and I need that energy for other things now. That's more grace than I deserve. Probably. But I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me, because I refuse to let what you did define the rest of my life. We sat in silence for a while longer. She asked about my physical recovery, and I gave her the basics. Full mobility restored, some lingering effects from muscle atrophy but nothing therapy wouldn't fix, clearance from the neurologist to live independently. She told me about my father's medication regimen and Derek's therapy sessions with an odd note of pride, as if recognizing that seeking help was an accomplishment. Eventually, she stood to leave. Thank you for meeting me, Natalie. I know I can't ask for more than this. You're right, you can't. But if Dad wants to talk, I'll consider it. On the same terms. Neutral location, no expectations. I'll tell him. After she left, I sat alone with my coffee, watching the autumn light shift through the window. A text came through from Grace asking about interview times for potential volunteers. Another from Marcus with an update on the final dissolution of the guardianship paperwork. Life continuing, pulling me forward whether I was ready or not. That evening, I drove out to a hiking trail in Forest Park, one of the places my grandmother used to take me when I needed to clear my head. The path wound upward through old-growth forest, Douglas firs towering overhead, the ground soft with fallen needles. My legs burned with the exertion, muscles still rebuilding their strength, but I pushed through. At the top of the ridge, there was a viewpoint overlooking the city. Portland spread out below, lights beginning to flicker on as dusk approached, the rivers cutting dark lines through the urban grid. I stood at the railing, breathing hard, and thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. The accident that should have killed me. The family that had tried to erase me. The doctor who'd fought for me. The judge who'd made them accountable. All of it leading here, to this ridge, this view, this version of myself that had survived it all. My phone buzzed. A message from Dr. Reynolds. First volunteer training session scheduled for next Thursday. 15 people signed up. Are you ready for this? I typed back. Ready as I'll ever be. Below, the city lights multiplied as night settled in. Somewhere down there was the hospital where I'd spent 8 months trapped in my own body. Somewhere was the courthouse where justice had been served cold and methodical. Somewhere was my parents' house where they were living with what they'd done. And somewhere, in the West Hills, was the house my grandmother had left me, being transformed into something that would outlast all of us. I wasn't the same person who'd gotten in that car 9 months ago. That woman had died in the ICU, in the silence between heartbeats, in the moment she'd heard her mother discuss selling her legacy while she screamed without sound. But someone new had emerged, forged in the recognition that survival isn't about going back to who you were. It's about deciding who you'll become. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain coming in from the coast. I pulled my jacket tighter and started back down the trail, my footsteps sure on the uneven ground, my breath steady, my direction chosen. Behind me, the city lights blurred and merged into a sea of possibility. Ahead, the path wound down into darkness that didn't frighten me anymore. I'd been to the other side of everything. I'd died and returned. And now I was building something from the wreckage that would matter more than any inheritance, more than any family name, more than the approval I'd spent years chasing. I was building a life that was entirely, unapologetically mine. The following weeks brought a rhythm I hadn't experienced since before the accident. Mornings meant reviewing applications from people who wanted to volunteer, reading stories that echoed my own in painful ways. Afternoons were spent in meetings with the board, refining protocols and policies, making sure every decision aligned with the mission of giving voice to the voiceless. Evenings I spent at physical therapy or working on the house, slowly making it into a space that honored both what it had been and what it was becoming. Dr. Reynolds brought me a patient case on a Tuesday. A woman in her 50s who'd suffered a stroke, her adult children arguing over whether to continue aggressive treatment or transition to comfort care. The woman couldn't speak, but her eyes tracked movement, showed response to stimuli. The doctors were uncertain. The family was divided. No one was asking what she might want if she could tell them. I reviewed the medical records, consulted with the ethics board, and arranged to visit the hospital. Standing in that ICU again, smelling the same antiseptic and hearing the same beeping monitors, I felt the past rise up like a tide. But this time I wasn't the one in the bed. I was the one fighting. We advocated for continued evaluation, for bringing in specialists who could assess her cognitive function more thoroughly, for giving her time before making irreversible decisions. It took 3 weeks, but eventually, the patient began to recover speech. Halting at first, then clearer. She told her children she wanted to fight, wanted to try therapy, wanted the chance to decide her own fate. That became our first official case. The patient who got her voice back, literally and figuratively. Dr. Reynolds documented it all for the nonprofit's records, and I wrote it up as a case study for training materials. Proof that the system could work differently when someone was willing to fight for it. My father called in November. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. His voice was quieter than I remembered, tired. Natalie. Thank you for taking my call. What do you need, Dad? I wanted to hear your voice. To tell you myself that I'm sorry. Your mother told me about your meeting, and I know she expressed regret, but I needed to say it too. What I did was unforgivable. You're right. It was. I know. I'm not asking you to forget it or to let me pretend it didn't happen. I just need you to know that I failed you, and I spend every day wishing I could go back and be the father you deserved. But you can't. No. I can't. He paused, and I heard something that might have been crying, or might have been just the poor phone connection. I heard about your nonprofit. About what you're building. From Derek? Yes. He's very proud of you. We both are, though I know that means nothing now. It means something, I admitted. Just not what you might want it to mean. That's fair. He cleared his throat. I won't take up more of your time. I just wanted you to know that I see what I did. I see who you are. And I'm sorry I spent so many years trying to make you into someone else. After we hung up, I sat with the conversation, turning it over. These apologies from my parents felt genuine, but they also felt incomplete, like trying to fill a canyon with a handful of dirt. They could acknowledge the harm, express regret, even change their behavior going forward. But they couldn't undo the months I'd spent trapped and terrified, couldn't erase the betrayal, couldn't restore the family we might have been if they'd chosen differently. And maybe that was okay. Maybe healing didn't require restoration. Maybe it just required recognition and the choice to move forward anyway. December brought the first snow, rare in Portland, transforming the city into something hushed and strange. The nonprofit officially opened on the 15th, a small ceremony attended by the board, a few volunteers, and surprisingly, Vanessa and Derek. My parents weren't invited, and they didn't ask to come. Some boundaries were necessary. We cut a ribbon I'd bought at a craft store, drank sparkling cider from mismatched glasses my grandmother had collected over the years, and stood in the warm house talking about the work ahead. Dr. Reynolds gave a short speech about the importance of patient autonomy. Grace talked about the dignity of being heard. I mostly just listened, grateful that something good had grown from so much pain. As people filtered out into the snowy evening, Derek hung back. "Can I talk to you for a second?" We stepped into the kitchen, away from the remaining guests. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Vanessa and I want to contribute to the nonprofit. We know money doesn't fix what I did, but we want to support what you're building." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a check for $25,000. I stared at it, then at him. "Derek, this is too much. It's not nearly enough. But it's what we can do right now. Consider it an investment in making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to someone else." I folded the envelope carefully. "Thank you. This will fund our first year of operations." "Good." He started to leave, then turned back. "I know I don't have the right to ask, but do you think someday you might be able to see me as your brother again? Not right away, but someday?" I thought about it honestly. Maybe. If you keep doing the work. If you keep being honest about what you did and why it was wrong. Maybe. That's more than I deserve. Probably. But I'm learning that what people deserve and what we choose to offer aren't always the same thing. After everyone left, I stood alone in the quiet house, looking at the space we'd created. The comfortable chairs arranged for conversation. The resources lining the shelves. The photos on the wall of my grandmother in her studio, a reminder of why this place existed. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the city, creating the kind of silence that feels like possibility. I thought about the woman I'd been before the accident, always seeking approval, always trying to fit into spaces that weren't built for her shape. I thought about the woman who'd woken from the coma to discover betrayal so complete it had rewritten her understanding of family. And I thought about who I was becoming now, someone who'd survived the unsurvivable and decided to build something beautiful from the ruins. The compass bracelet caught the light from the lamp beside me. I touched it gently, feeling its familiar weight, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be. Not because the path had been easy or the destination was perfect, but because every step had been mine to choose, every decision had been made with eyes wide open, every scar had been earned in the service of becoming someone I could respect. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, I turned off the lights one by one and locked the door behind me, leaving the house ready for whatever came next. Spring arrived with the kind of gentle insistence that makes you believe in second chances. Cherry blossoms erupted along the streets, pink and white against blue skies that seemed impossibly clear after months of gray. I stood at the window of what had become my office, watching volunteers arrive for our weekly training session, their voices carrying through the open windows along with the scent of fresh-cut grass and possibility. 6 months since we'd opened. 42 cases handled. 31 patients who'd received advocacy when they couldn't speak for themselves. Numbers that represented lives, families, moments where someone had stood in the gap and said this person matters, their wishes matter, their dignity matters. The work was harder than I'd imagined. Every case brought echoes of my own experience, moments where I had to step back and let Grace or one of the other trained advocates take the lead because I was too close to it, too raw. But it was also more meaningful than anything I'd done before. Each patient who regained their voice, literally or figuratively, felt like a small redemption. Dr. Reynolds appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. "Got a minute?" "Always." "What's up?" She settled into the chair across from my desk. "I had coffee with Patricia Simmons yesterday." "Judge Simmons." She wanted to know more about what we're doing here. I raised an eyebrow. "The judge from my case?" "The very same. Apparently she's been following our work, saw the article in the Oregonian about the nonprofit. She's interested in potentially collaborating, maybe developing some judicial guidelines for patient advocacy in guardianship cases." I absorbed this, the symmetry of it. The judge who'd ruled in my favor now wanted to help make sure other people didn't need to fight the same battle. That's incredible. She wants to meet with you directly. Talk about your experience, get your input on what systemic changes might prevent situations like yours. When? Next week if you're available. I told her I'd check with you first. Yes. Absolutely yes. After Dr. Reynolds left, I sat with the implications. My story, the thing I'd lived through in isolation and terror, could potentially reshape how courts approached vulnerable patients. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me might become the catalyst for protecting others. It felt like closing a circle I hadn't known was incomplete. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. I hadn't been since right after the trial, too caught up in building the nonprofit and rebuilding myself. The grounds were well maintained, spring flowers planted in neat rows between headstones. I found her marker easily, a simple granite stone with her name and dates and a line from a Mary Oliver poem she'd loved. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I sat on the grass beside her grave, not caring that the damp would stain my jeans. Hey, Grandma. Sorry it's been a while. The wind moved through the trees overhead, carrying the sound of birds and distant traffic and life continuing its relentless march forward. I told her about the nonprofit, about the patients we'd helped, about Judge Simmons wanting to meet. I told her about the apologies from my parents and how I still didn't know what to do with them. I told her about Derek's therapy and Vanessa's steadfast support and how family was becoming something I was learning to define on my own terms. You were right, I said finally. About leaving me the house. About believing I could build something that mattered. I just wish you were here to see it. A shadow fell across the grass beside me. I looked up, startled, to find my father standing a few feet away. He looked older in the bright spring light, the lines in his face deeper, his shoulders more stooped. He held a small bouquet of daisies, my grandmother's favorite. I didn't mean to intrude, he said quietly. I come here sometimes. To talk to her. To apologize for what I did to you. I stood slowly, brushing grass from my jeans. How long have you been coming here? Since the trial. Maybe once a month. She was always the one who saw clearly, who called us out when we were wrong. I figure if I can't talk to you, I can at least tell her I'm trying to do better. We stood in awkward silence, two people who shared blood and history but had become strangers through choices both active and passive. Finally, I gestured to the grave. You can put those down. She'd like that you remembered daisies. He knelt stiffly, arranging the flowers against the headstone with more care than I'd ever seen him give anything. When he stood, his eyes were wet. Your mother told me about your meeting. That you heard her out. I know I don't have the right to ask, but would you be willing to do the same for me? I considered refusing. Walking away would be easier, cleaner. But something about standing at my grandmother's grave, about spring blooming all around us, about the work I was building from the ashes of betrayal, made me willing to try. Not for him. For myself. To prove I could face this and still choose my own peace. There's a bench over there, I said, pointing to a wrought iron seat under an oak tree. 20 minutes. That's all I'm offering. That's more than I deserve. We walked to the bench and sat at opposite ends, a careful distance maintained. He didn't speak immediately, seeming to gather his thoughts the way I'd seen him do before important business meetings. Except this wasn't business. This was the reckoning he'd avoided for months. I've been seeing a therapist, he began. Your mother and I both have, separately and together. Trying to understand how we became people who could do what we did to you. And what have you learned? That I was so focused on control and appearances that I forgot how to love people who didn't fit my expectations. That I treated you like a problem to be managed instead of a person to be cherished. That when you were in that hospital bed, I saw an end to what I'd convinced myself was a burden, and I took it. His voice cracked on the last words. I didn't look at him, keeping my eyes on the cemetery stretching out before us, orderly rows of stones marking lives lived and lost. The DNR order, I said quietly. That's the part one can't get past. You were willing to let me die. Yes. And I will carry that for the rest of my life. There's no justification, no explanation that makes it acceptable. I looked at my daughter, my child, and I chose my own comfort over her life. Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me? Nothing. He said it simply, with a finality that sounded like truth. I don't want forgiveness because I haven't earned it and may never. I don't want reconciliation because I understand that trust, once broken this completely, doesn't mend. I just want you to know that I see what I did. I see you. And I'm spending whatever time I have left trying to be a person who would never make that choice again. I turned to look at him then, really look. The father I'd known had been robust, commanding, always certain of his rightness. This man was diminished, worn by guilt and consequence and the knowledge that some mistakes echo forever. Part of me took satisfaction in his suffering. A larger part just felt sad. The nonprofit I'm building, I said. It exists because of what you did to me. Every patient we help, every family we keep from making the choices you made, that's the direct result of your betrayal. I know. Derek showed me the article. He paused. I donated to it. Anonymously. I didn't want you to feel obligated or uncomfortable, but I wanted to support the work even if I can't support you directly anymore. How much? 50,000. Not as atonement, because money can't atone for what I did. But as acknowledgement that something good should come from something terrible. I processed this. 50,000 would fund a full-time coordinator, expand our reach, help more people. My parents' betrayal had already given me the house and the initial resources. Now it was giving me more. Pain transformed into purpose, over and over. Thank you, I said carefully. For the donation and for being honest. Can I ask you something? His voice was tentative. Are you happy? Not content or managing, but actually happy. I thought about it honestly. I'm building something meaningful. I have people in my life who showed up when it mattered. I'm healthy and independent and making choices that feel right. Is that happiness? Maybe. Or maybe it's something better. Purpose. Your grandmother would be proud of that answer. She would. I stood, signaling the end of our conversation. I need to get back. Training session this afternoon. He stood too. Thank you for the time, Natalie. I meant what I said. I don't expect anything from you. But if you ever want to talk, or if there's something I can do to support your work without intruding on your life, I'm here. I nodded once and walked away, not looking back. When I reached my car, I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, processing the encounter. It hadn't given me closure, exactly. But it had given me clarity. My father was trying to change, genuinely it seemed, but that didn't obligate me to let him back into my life. People could grow and heal separately. Forgiveness could exist without reconciliation. And I could acknowledge his efforts without sacrificing my own boundaries. The meeting with Judge Simmons the following week took place in her chambers, a book-lined office that smelled like leather and old paper. She was exactly as I remembered from the courtroom, sharp-eyed and direct, but softer somehow in this informal setting. Miss Harper, she began after we'd settled into chairs across from her desk. Thank you for coming. I've been following your nonprofit's work with great interest. Thank you for taking the time, Judge. Please, call me Patricia. We're colleagues now in a sense, both working toward justice in patient care. She leaned forward slightly. I wanted to talk to you about expanding patient advocacy rights within the guardianship system. Your case highlighted significant gaps in how courts oversee the care of incapacitated individuals. We spent the next 2 hours discussing possibilities. Mandatory advocacy reviews for anyone under guardianship beyond 90 days. Requirements for medical second opinions before DNR orders could be authorized. Protocols for investigating guardians who showed signs of self-dealing. Patricia took notes, asked probing questions, pushed back on ideas that might not be legally feasible while encouraging others that could reshape the system. As we wrapped up, she set down her pen and looked at me seriously. I want you to know something. Your case was one of the most clear-cut instances of guardianship abuse I've seen in 20 years on the bench. But it's not isolated. I see shades of it more often than I'd like to admit. What you're building could prevent untold suffering. That's the goal. Keep doing it. And if you ever need someone to testify before the legislature or advocate at the policy level, call me. This work matters more than you know. Leaving her chambers, I felt something shift in my understanding of my own story. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was part of a larger pattern, a systemic problem that could be addressed through the very thing that had nearly destroyed me. My suffering had meaning beyond my own survival. Summer arrived in a cascade of heat and long evenings. The nonprofit moved into a steady rhythm. We'd hired 2 part-time staff members, trained 35 volunteers, and expanded to take cases outside the immediate Portland area. Media coverage increased. A local news station did a feature story. Other states started reaching out, asking how they could replicate the model. Through it all, I maintained my boundaries with my parents. My mother sent occasional texts, updates on my father's health or small observations about the weather. I responded politely but briefly. My father's anonymous donations continued quarterly, always accompanied by a brief note that said simply, "For the work." Derek and I met for coffee once a month, conversations that were still sometimes awkward but growing more authentic as he continued his own healing process. Aunt Helen remained my anchor, showing up for board meetings and volunteering her legal expertise and reminding me regularly that I was loved unconditionally. Grace became a true friend, someone who understood the mission viscerally and brought both competence and compassion to every case. Dr. Reynolds served as my mentor and occasionally my reality check when I took on too much or let a case get too personal. One evening in late August, I found myself back at the waterfront park where I'd walked the night before the judge's ruling. The river moved past, dark and eternal, carrying the city's reflection on its surface. I leaned against the railing and thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, freshly awake from the coma, discovering betrayal and building a case for justice. That woman had been angry, rightfully so. She'd been determined to prove her worth through the legal system, to make her family pay for what they'd done. And she'd succeeded. The court had ruled in her favor. Assets had been restored. Accountability had been established. But the woman I was now understood something that earlier version hadn't. The real victory wasn't the ruling or the returned property or even the nonprofit, as important as those things were. The real victory was standing here by the river, knowing my worth wasn't dependent on anyone's acknowledgement. Not the courts, not my family's, not even my own on days when doubt crept in. I'd survived the unsurvivable. Not just the accident or the coma, but the knowledge that the people who should have protected me had instead seen me as an opportunity. And from that survival, I'd built something that protected others. My phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. Case ruling came through. The hospital agreed to our patient advocacy protocols. We set the precedent. I smiled, typing back a quick congratulations, then put the phone away. Around me, the city hummed with evening activity. Joggers passed on the path. A family spread a picnic on the grass. Somewhere upstream, someone was playing guitar, the notes carrying over the water. This was my life now. Not defined by what had been done to me, but by what I chose to do with what remained. Not about proving I deserved to be treated better, but about treating others the way I'd needed to be treated when I was helpless. I touched the compass bracelet on my wrist, feeling its familiar weight, and thought about my grandmother's note tucked inside her savings book. For the youngest because she has the biggest heart. Use it when they forget who you are. They had forgotten. My parents, lost in their own fears and selfishness, had forgotten I was their daughter who deserved protection. They'd forgotten I was a person with dreams and dignity and a right to my own future. But in forgetting, they'd inadvertently given me the greatest gift. They'd forced me to remember for myself. I wasn't who my parents wanted me to be. I wasn't even who I'd been before the accident, that woman seeking approval and trying to fit into spaces too small for her shape. I was someone entirely new, forged in silence and powerlessness and the fierce determination to make sure no one else suffered the same way. The last light faded from the sky, stars appearing one by one in the deepening blue. I stayed at the railing, watching the river carry the day into night, and felt something settle in my chest that I'd been seeking since the moment I woke in that hospital bed. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being fixed or everyone apologizing correctly or even from justice being served. The kind that comes from knowing your own worth independent of anyone else's recognition. The kind that comes from building something meaningful from the wreckage of what tried to destroy you. I would never thank my parents for what they did. The betrayal was too profound, the wounds too deep. But I could acknowledge that their worst act had inadvertently revealed my greatest strength. Not my ability to fight or to win or to make them pay, though I'd done all those things. My greatest strength was my ability to transform pain into purpose, to take what was meant to erase me and use it to make sure others were seen. A year ago, I'd withdrawn everything from that hospital room. My silence, my name, my loyalty. I'd taken back what they'd tried to steal. But the real withdrawal, the one that mattered most, was simpler than that. I'd withdrawn my belief that I needed their love to be worthy of love. I'd withdrawn my acceptance of their version of who I should be. I'd withdrawn my presence from a family that saw me as an obligation rather than a gift. And in that space, I deposited something far more valuable. Belief in myself. Trust in my own judgment. Faith that I could build a life that mattered on my own terms. The river kept moving, indifferent and eternal. I watched it for a while longer, then turned and walked back toward the parking lot, toward the car that would take me home to the house my grandmother had protected for me, toward the work that gave my survival meaning. Behind me, the city lights reflected on dark water, beautiful and transient. Ahead, the path wound into darkness that no longer frightened me. I'd been to the other side of everything and come back changed, scarred, but somehow more whole than I'd ever been before. Tomorrow there would be more patients to advocate for, more cases to fight, more work to do. But tonight, I just walked through the warm summer air, compass bracelet catching streetlight, heart steady, direction chosen. I was exactly where I needed to be. Not because the journey had been kind or the destination was perfect, but because every step forward was mine, earned through survival and stubbornness and the refusal to let cruelty have the final word. They'd tried to bury me while I was still breathing. They hadn't counted on me digging my way back out, bringing others with me, and building something beautiful on the ground where they'd meant to leave me forgotten. That was my withdrawal. That was my victory. That was my life, wild and precious and entirely my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.